7. With our report to Count Galleon, the agate key quest was over. Asa and I received a huge amount of experience, and as on the 4th floor, we had our choice of item rewards. That was fantastic, of course, but what made us even happier was learning that Kismel was given a full day of downtime. She could do whatever she wanted tomorrow, January 4th, and she didn't need to go to the 7th floor until the morning of the 5th. I was still worried about the frontline group reaching the south area by tomorrow afternoon, but I did pass along the info about that new centipede boss through Argo, so I didn't think there was any danger of them fighting it unprepared. We had to take part in the Labyrinth Tower and floor boss fight, of course, but if Kismel gave us more of those droplets of Vile, we could go straight from the 2nd area to the 5th one, and if not, we could probably still catch up with the group using the normal route in about half a day, assuming the pathway dungeons had been cleared out. I said as much to Asana after we returned to the room on the 3rd floor of the west wing, and we agreed that we would spend tomorrow taking it easy. When we returned to the hallway to meet Kismel, we went to the basement bath to wash off the imaginary sweat and grime of the day. In order to avoid repeating yesterday's tragedy, we agreed beforehand to keep each half of the bathing area separate between the sexes. But hearing the two women chatting and laughing on the other side of the spirit tree roots did not make the process any easier to me. When we were done bathing, we relaxed in the waiting area for a while before heading to the dining hall. The main course today was grilled fish. Not only did it not have the strangely spiced sauce that the game's humans cooks like to use, the fish's skin was crispy and fragrant, and I had to go ask for seconds. We enjoyed some tea after the meal, chatting and reminiscing about the events of the 4th and 5th floor. I left the dining hall feeling extremely satisfied. Gizmo left briefly to return the green leaf cape to the treasure repository she borrowed it from. So Asa and I decided to explore the castle a bit. We started walking towards the east wing, which we hadn't yet seen in our time here. Just then, there was a bell ringing in the darkened courtyard. We stopped, noting with muted interest that they still rang the bells after bathing and dinner time, and then I recalled that this was not actually a time for zoning out. Hadn't Kismel said that the bell only rang when the south gate opened? And as a basic rule, the dark elves in the castle did not leave it. The bell was alerting us to the fact that players, aside from ourselves, had shown up in Castle Galley. Asana figured it out at the same time I did. We shared a look, then dashed to a window. When we looked at the courtyard, pressed against the glass, we saw that the mammoth gates were indeed very slowly opening. My first thought was that this visitor was Morche, or the dagger user, or even both at once. Castle Galley was outside the safe haven zone, so nothing would stop them from coming in with criminal orange cursors. All they would need to open the gates were the same sigil of Lysula rings that we had. Last night, I surmised that it would be difficult for them to get through the Dark Elf side of the campaign in time, but there was no absolute evidence of that. "We need to figure out who just showed up," Asana murmured, her voice tense. I pushed away my brief moment of indecision and said, "Yes, let's go down. Make sure you're geared up." "Got it." We turned and started running for the stairs, both opening our game menus. We switched from indoor wear to my usual combat gear and equipped our beloved weapons. I barely registered the steps as we flew down to the first floor of the west wing. Rather than the main doors to the castle, we rushed to a side door at the end of the hallway and opened it a crack to peer out into the courtyard. The bell was still ringing, but the door was already in the process of closing. If the visitors had already vanished into the spacious castle, it would be very difficult to find them. But even then, we could probably ask the soldiers near the door what the players looked like. I steeled my courage and went into the open, heading toward them along the sheer wall cut into the rock. About after 5 steps, Asana reached out and grabbed my collar. I let out a strangled yelp and came to a stop. What was that for?" "Look, Kirito," she whispered back, pointing in the direction of the courtyard spirit tree, rather than the gate. As soon as I looked that way, I blinked. There were 4 people gathered around the spirit tree's spring, their backs towards us. Their cursors were the very same green color as ours. Based on their number, it probably wasn't Morche's group. And for one thing, Morche and I had an official duel on the 3rd floor, so our names would display for each other, making one of those 4 cursors read Morche, but all I could see were HP bars and guild tags. Cabau's Einkrad Liberation Squad had a tag of gray sword and shield on a green background. Lynn's Dragon Knights Brigade used a silver dragon on a blue field. But this guild tag was neither of those. It was an unfamiliar mark, like the letter Q, in gold against the black background. "Have you seen that insignia before, Kirito?" Asuna whispered. I shook my head. "No, do you? Well, I guess you wouldn't have asked if you did." She did not reply, but I sensed her head bobbing. The system had confirmed that Morche was not among the 4, and it didn't seem likely for them that the PK group, led by the man in the black poncho, would form a guild and register it with such a distinct and memorable logo. But it wasn't confirmed yet that the 2 things were unrelated. This castle was not a safe haven, so we had to be careful at all times. I was standing there, plastered against the rough rock face, wondering what to do when Asuna whispered, "Hey, let's say that some humans, players, get into a fight inside the castle, and their cursors go orange. How do you suppose the Dark Elves would react? Would they ignore it, or..." I didn't have an immediate answer to that one. The reason that the orange criminal players couldn't get into human towns with the anti-criminal code wasn't because of some magical barrier that repelled anyone who was evil. Is because you'd get attacked by tremendously powerful NPC guards. In the beta, there were people who intentionally went orange, then stepped into town so they could try to fight and defeat the Guardians. They called themselves Guardlers. Apparently that was short for guard killers. But unlike the Sudokers in Stachyon, from what I heard, no one had actually succeeded by the end of the beta test. Most likely, the Dark Elf soldiers in Castle Galley were not as unfairly powerful as the Guardians of Peace in player towns, but I felt like they would not simply ignore humans running around with swords inside their castle, either. I could say for certain that if those 4 players attacked us, Kismel at the very least would come to our aid, and if she ordered them to, the castle guards would get involved too. I condensed all that logic into a simple, "I don't think they'd ignore the entire thing." Asuna agreed. "Exactly, so let's just talk to them." "Yeah, I guess that's the only real choice," I admitted. Unless we simply left the castle altogether, there was no way we could lurk around the place without being spotted, and we had still too much to do around here. We walked away from the darkness of the wall, ready to draw our swords if need be, towards the 4 players who still gazed at the spring water before them. Neither of us was particularly trying to hide our footsteps, but even within 10 meters, none of the players with their backs to us reacted at all. They probably too engrossed in their conversation. "You'd better not. You'll get yelled at." "Yeah, but I at least want to try it once. Nobody's ever confirmed if the Blelfs are the only ones who can teleport from the spirit trees." "Fine, test it out, but if you vanish, we're not going after you. If the guards get mad, we're running and leaving you behind." It sounded like the group was 3 men and 1 woman. Based on the content of their conversation, they were definitely running the campaign quests on the Dark Elf side. The term Blelf was mysterious to me, though. We stopped 2 meters behind them, and they didn't notice, so I sent Asuna a telepathic message to take it away and took a half step back. Her look went from the exasperated to the ultra-sociable before she called out pleasantly, "Good evening." The group of 4 was shocked, whirling around on the spot, but no one reached for their weapons. They all stared at Asuna for about 5 seconds, stunned, before their eyes traveled a bit higher. That was probably a sign that they were examining her color cursor. Then they looked at her again, for 3 seconds, before finally noticing me over her shoulder. The first to speak was the woman, who used a large scimitar and a smallish buckler. Good evening. I'm sorry, you startled us. Oh, no, I apologize for shouting like that out of nowhere. Said Asuna with a smile, and the apprehension in the other party's face instantly vanished. If I had spoken to them instead, it would have taken 10 times as long for them to soften up. Wow, you really got me jumpy. I never really expected to actually see another player here. That was the small man with the two-handed sword who talked about wanting to test the spirit tree's teleportation earlier. Now he was rubbing his breastplate instead. Next to him was a tall and skinny fellow with a glaive who shrugged. Of course there will be players here. The castle is public. The last man, with an odd combination of a tower shield, thick as a metal slab, and slender short spear. He had a stubby beard and an affable smile as he offered his hand. Hi there. We're in a guild called Quasac. We're going through the Dark Elf campaign right now. So apparently, Blelf was their nickname for Dark Elves. As Asuna and I shook the shield man's head, I idly wondered what their nickname for the Forest Elves was. Then came introductions. The scimitar woman, who seemed smart and sensible, was Lazuli. The lackadaisical guy with two-handed sword was Temu. The rather sharp, tall glaive user was Heiston. Lastly, the hardy and bold shield-bearer was Gindo. I didn't recognize any of their names, or the Quasac guild, neither did Asuna. There were 8,000 players currently trapped on this floating fortress, so of course nobody can memorize the names of them all. In fact, I probably knew less than 100 players by name. If we crossed paths at one of the main towns on another floor, I wouldn't think twice about them. But Castle Galley was the wild frontier as of January 3rd. They had to beat as many of those nasty poisonous monsters in the canyon on the way here, and they didn't even have a full 6-person party. They had to be pretty close to us in level. So how was it possible that I'd never seen them before? I almost wanted to be rude and ask if they definitely weren't NPCs, but another glance at their cursors revealed the pristine green. While I was on the mean streak, I glanced at their armor and attempted to price it all. 2 had light metal armor, and the other 2 had heavy, and they were all this deep, rich shine of expensive quality. And despite just having come through a deadly map to get here, their gear looked fresh and unharmed outside of Lazuli's and Gindo's shields. Perhaps they were players who didn't burst out of the gate when the game started 2 months ago, but had the talent to catch up to the frontline players afterward. If so, that was a heartening thought. It seemed likely that the ALS would recruit them before too long, I thought. Are you two doing the elf quest on your own? Asked Lazuli, the scimitar girl, stepping forward. Her dark green hair was tied into a ponytail, and her proud features and husky but piercing voice gave her an air of vitality and activity. I gave Asuna another take-it-away psychic message. She looked at me sidelong before smiling again and replying, Yes, that's right. We just got to this castle yesterday, in fact. Does that mean you're in the advancing group? Well, technically, Asuna shrugged. Lazuli's big eyes got even bigger. Wow, I've never met one of them before, and you're so pretty. I can't believe it. There was nothing but honest surprise and delight in her voice, but for a brief moment, the 3 men behind her shared an uncomfortable look. What was that about? I wondered instantly, but I couldn't read their minds from their expression alone. After constantly being around Asuna for so long, I was only just now starting to understand the way she thought about things, possibly. Asuna would have noticed the men's reaction too, but she continued speaking with Lazuli without betraying any hint of suspicion. She talked about how we were part of the frontline group, but not in any guild, and Lazuli mentioned that the Quasac 4 left the Town of Beginnings 4 weeks ago. At that point, Asuna suggested we continue talking in the dining hall. The hungry adventurers immediately agreed, and we headed through the entrance hall of Castle Galley to the 2nd floor. Kismel's task of the treasure repository would be done by now, but I didn't see her in the dining hall. In all honesty, I couldn't anticipate what might happen when she interacted with players other than us, so I decided it wasn't worth searching for her. The 6 of us sat down at the table by a window. A steward came over, so Asa and I just asked for tea, while Gindo's group ordered the meal course plus bread. And they got seconds of the fish, too. Only Heiston, the glaive user, stuck to his one plate. When we finished first, there was an apologetic look on his gaunt face. "You'll have to excuse them. We're broke as a general rule, so now that we're here at the Dark Elf base and the food is free, they can't help themselves." Temu, whose head was shaved like a high school baseball player's, chomped down on a fish head first, then butted Heiston on the shoulder. "Don't act all smooth and in control in front of the pretty girl. In the 5th floor elf village, you were double-fisting those skewers. And you had 3 in each hand." They were a jolly bunch, but once again, something about them seemed off to me. Heiston said they were broke, but they had the very expensive equipment. And if they had the skill to get this far, and assuming they weren't pouring their funds into sketchy items or gambling, they should at least have enough coal to spend on decent food. And obviously, I wasn't going to pry into their financial situation of a guild I just met. So I sat back and sipped my tea. Then, with the most effortlessly natural smile and tone of voice imaginable, Asuna said, "So how do you all know each other?" Considering that she was like a prickly hedgehog when we first met at Tolbana on the 1st floor, Asuna transformed into quite the pleasant socialite. The thought sent a little snort out through my nose, rippling the liquid in my teacup. Sensing my thoughts, the fencer gently stepped on top of my left foot, sending a very clear signal not to say anything out of line. Unaware that this act of intimidation was happening under the table, the 4 exchanged another look, including Lazuli this time. Gindo, the bearded dandy, though of a different sort than Okatan from the ALS, wiped his mouth politely with a napkin before responding. "We met in the town of beginnings, but we never planned to actually leave the town at first. We were more like an informational exchange fraternity." "Informational exchange?" Asuna repeated. Gindo could sense the suspicion in her voice and explained, "I know this will sound pathetic to you, given your place in the game, but the waiters back in the town of beginnings who chose to stay safe until the game is beaten still get hungry and sleepy every day. You won't die without food here, of course, and you can sleep on the street, but everyone wants a hot meal and a soft bed. That means you need money for food and lodgings each day." This was true, and though I hadn't been back to the 1st floor in a while, I knew that it was much harder than it sounded. The quickest way to earn coal was to beat monsters. SEO wasn't the kind of game that said, "Bugs and animals wouldn't be carrying gold coins." So even the weaklings, wormlings, and boars right outside of the town of beginnings dropped a few coal, killed 10 a day, and you could afford a decent meal and a place to sleep. But even against boars, there was no way to eliminate the possibility of an accident happening. Focus too much on the one monster, and you might miss the sound of another one popping into existence nearby, and end up linking the two in combat. Through repetition of little mistakes or lapses in judgment like this, one gained knowledge, experience, and ultimately strength. But in this world, you had only one life that could pay the price of a mistake. Most likely, the majority of the 2,000 players who already dropped out of the deadly game did so not far from the town of beginnings. And according to Argo's rough calculations, that included a few hundred beta testers. One mistake, one accident leading to panic, was all that it took to deplete your hit points, no matter how much you knew about the game. But we didn't earn our money by going out into the wilderness and beating mobs. As a matter of fact, there are lots of quests in the town of beginnings if you'd look for them, Gindo said. It was my turn to repeat his words. Quests? Yes, of course. We couldn't mess with the ones like go out of town and get this thingy, or beat X number of monsters. But within the city, you can do stuff like errands and finding lost objects, and even some rare ones like house cleaning and pet walking. Oh, right, said Lazuli, who was picking up at the side of pickled vegetables that came with the grilled fish. The one where you had to go clean up the hoarder's house? That was a tough one. There were piles and piles of items all throughout the house, and you had to separate them into these huge wooden boxes out in the yard. You had to sort every last item perfectly to beat the quest, and lots of them you couldn't really tell if they were toys or practical items or... Did you know that if you pilfer the coins and jewels and all the stuff in those piles, you get locked in the basement of the mansion for like half a day? Temu added. Hyson sighed. Only you would attempt something like that. The bickering made Asuna giggle. The erstwhile leader Gindo smiled wryly and spread his hands. The point is, there are lots of quests that give you safe earnings, but since they don't endanger your life, they're all tedious instead. We started running into each other so much at the various quest spots that we naturally got into trading information. That's right. At first I tried to keep my distance from this fishy old guy, said Lazuli, pointing her fork at Gindo. He whined, I'm not that old. Although his looks and manners were completely different, I saw a similarity in Gindo's gestures to the scimitar-wielding man named Climb, who I'd spent a few hours hunting boars with on the first day of the game. He stayed behind at the Town of Beginnings to be with his friends. Was he hard at work at leveling up now so he could reach the frontier? Or was he staying put to focus on his safety? His name was still in my friends list, so I could write him a message whenever I wanted, but the last 2 months had passed without any communication between us. I suppose I felt guilty about abandoning him and chose not to draw attention to it by reaching out now. Mentally speaking, the Town of Beginnings felt endlessly distant, but with the teleportation gate, it was, in fact, just a step away. If we had an opportunity to go to Statchen, maybe it would be nice to visit the bottom floor again. Just then, Lazuli said, Still, as a general rule, there are no downside to rewards when doing quests as a group. If you work together, you get it done quicker, and you can use the extra time to search for Japanese books to read. Pretty soon, our little info trading group became a cooperative strategy group. Oh, I see, murmured Asuna, who was satisfied with that answer. She lifted the toe of her boot off my foot onto the table. It seemed perfectly natural that people would work together to clear out city quests in the Town of Beginnings, but this was Castle Gali, right on the frontier. There was a huge mental leap involved in going from a group that banded together to avoid the danger of fighting monsters to an official in-game guild, meaning they completed the tricky and dangerous guild quest on the 3rd floor, with fancy gear that could knock out the scorpions in that dusty canyon on the way to this castle. Eiston sensed my suspicion and turned to look me square in the face with his long purplish hair waving. Now that we've gotten to this part of the story, we might as well see it through to the end. When we started the group, we were making pretty solid income for a while. However, the Town of Beginnings might be big, but it doesn't have an endless supply of quests. Some are daily quests that can only be done once a day, but when the word got around about them, so many people tried them, and you had to wait half a day just to be able to undertake them. Oh, that makes sense, I said. Gindo, bearded dandy, picked up it from there. The city quest got picked up clean before the 1st floor was cleared out, so we were in trouble. Not that I'm criticizing you folks in the front line group, just the opposite. We're very grateful for your hard work, and we feel bad that you're doing all this for our benefit. We couldn't even imagine trying to do what you do, clearing out labyrinths and beating floor bosses. Huh? That's not true, though, I said, a bit more blunt than I probably needed to be. You appear to have some high-grade gear. If you can get to this place, then I wouldn't imagine that you can fight in the labyrinth towers without too much trouble. I wanted to ask them if they'd helped out by joining a raid group, but all 4 suddenly began shaking their heads. No way, we can't. We're not like that, Lazuli started to protest, but Gindo cut her off. Let's explain in order. I told you how the quests in the Town of Beginnings ran dry. Well, at that point, we had some decent savings, so we weren't going to go hungry anytime soon. But even staying in the cheapest inns, the wallet eventually is going to empty out. So the 4 of us talked it over and weighed 2 options. Ration our money for as long as it can go in the town safely, or blow it all and buy gear and potions and leave the town. Huh? If you had that option, you should have just picked that from the start, I thought, before I realized something. Oh, right. If you beat quests, you get more than just money. You get experience points. Exactly, said Temo, fishtail sticking out of his mouth. He worked his lips to pull the rest of it inside and crunched away with a smile. By the time we were done with the interior quest in the Town of Beginnings, we were already level 5. 5? I gaped. Asa and I shared a look. I'd left the town at level 1 after Akihito Kayaba's tutorial speech, but I remember that when I got the anneal blade at the town of Harunoka, I was still only level 4. A team of 4 level 5 players with good gear would need a disastrous anti-miracle to lose to the worm or and boars around the starting of the town. But the thing about MMORPGs was that the possibility of disaster was always present. For players who stayed in the safety of town for nearly a month to finally leave that safe zone, there had to be some motive that pushed them along. We did feel reassured that our levels were higher, but the reason I argued we should go out into the world was a simpler one than that, said Heiston shyly, holding his teacup with both hands. I just wanted to do more quests. SAO quests tend to be detailed, but many also feel like they've been written by a child. You just can't tell what's going to happen in them. It feels like the moments when we were thinking hard about the clue that will solve the riddle, or running around town looking for that one missing item, and the only moments when we can actually forget we're playing a game that's trying to kill us. Huh? Is that seriously what you were thinking? Lazuli yelped, grumpily, bopping Heiston on the shoulder. The scowl turned into a grin, very soon though. You should have just said that instead. Then we wouldn't have to argue over all those hours. Yeah, well, we all knew that you were the biggest quest lover of the bunch already, Temu pointed out. Heiston flushed and tried to argue that he wasn't that obsessed. Gindo smirked again. At this way, his companions bickered and got the discussion back on track. Anyway, we decided to use just about all of our coal to buy gear and went out of town. First, we went through all the extermination and harvesting quests that we couldn't do before. Then, we all got to level 6 and earned a new skill slot. At that point, I even started to think that at the rate we were going, we'd catch up to the top group before long. Suddenly, the smile left his lips. He clenched his hands into fists. We finished all the quests in Harunoka and Madai with ease. Then, we tried to take a shortcut through the swamp to Tolbana. In the week since leaving town, we'd thought we'd gotten good at fighting, and the kobolds around there were easy enough, so we got cocky. We came across a group of 3 kobolds in the swamp and didn't realize one was new to us. Was it the swamp kobold trapper? I asked. Kendo looked surprised but nodded. Yes, I believe that was the name. At the time, I used a one-handed sword, but the snare the kobold threw tangled up my blade, and I fell into the swamp. I tried to pick it up, but while I was reaching for the muck for it, another kobold attacked me. You didn't read the strategy guide? Asuna asked, her voice just a little bit harder than before. I'm pretty sure it was being distributed for free in Madai by that point. Oh, Gindo turned uncomfortably to look at his friends, then sighed. We made use of it when leaving the Town of Beginnings, of course. It's just, those guild guides are mainly about monsters and items, and their quest info is limited to the big ones and the combat ones. We were proud, arrogant even, about having completed all the quests in the Town of Beginnings. We began thinking that we knew more than the book did, so we only flipped briefly through the updated version in Madai, and when we read it closely afterwards, we saw that there was a full breakdown of the swamp kobold trapper, and warnings about the danger it posted. I opened my mouth to say something, but realized I didn't know what I could actually say. The contents of Argo's strategy guides naturally skewed towards safety information. That was the reason she made and distributed them in the first place, and she was going to need full writing staff to actually cover all the quests that didn't have the potential to be deadly. At That time, I was close to dying, and Temu and Lazuli were in the yellow too, Gendo said, head downcast with shame. I was in full-blown panic. I just wanted to run away, but I was in a swamp, so running was hard. All I knew was that I was going to die. We ran and ran like people possessed, and finally threw them off, but at that point, our spirits were broken. I'd been fighting at the front lines of player progress since SAOs officially launched, but the number of times I'd felt the Grim Reaper reaching for my neck was surprisingly few. But I understood exactly what he meant when he spoke of broken spirits. I still felt a vivid chill run down my spine when I recalled the moment fighting Asterius, the Taurus King, on the second floor, when I'd been paralyzed by his lightning attack, helpless to do anything but look up at the approaching boss. The fact that I didn't drop out of the advancing group and hide safely in town after that was probably because I was with Asuna. I supposed she would say something like, "I'd rather die than give up," and I couldn't possibly leave her on her own devices and return to the town of beginnings. I imagine that these four had probably stuck it through it because they're personal bonds. Meanwhile, Gendo continued. When we returned to Madai, battered and broken, there were about 10 players in the town square shouting about something. When we asked what happened, they said the first floor boss had been beaten while we were out adventuring. That was exciting and wonderful, and we were grateful to the players who did it. But we honestly felt conflicted. Gendo sighed, and close-shaven Temu stepped in. It's like they were defeated and miserable, and then we were hear that news? It just pointed out how unfit we were. Like I played in a youthful baseball league until middle school. Huh? I yelped. Only half of that was surprised that he was actually a baseball player, like I'd imagined. And the other half was that he was willing to divulge real-world details about himself to strangers. Temu seemed surprised by the reaction, but Heiston shook his head with an annoyance. We always tell you don't dredge up or talk of the outside. So what? I can talk about my own life if I want to, right? He asked, turning to me for validation. I awkwardly agreed. Yeah. See, in baseball, it's really easy to tell if you're outclassed. It's true of all sports, of course, but there were always at least one guy in your team that you realize you'll never be better than. And when you play in a tournament and you find monsters that even he can't overcome in competition, only the people who keep at it and don't let that discourage them will reach the top. But I couldn't hack it. When I heard that the boss was beaten, I remembered feeling it again. That feeling of being like in the stands of the park, yelling at myself hoarse, and sensing just how far away it all felt. He trailed off, his eyes gazing into space. It was like he was watching the heat haze over the baseball field in midsummer. As someone who actually present in the battle against Ilfang the Kobold Lord, the first floor boss, I should have said something, but I couldn't find the words, Temu was talking about was being outclassed and feeling like we were so distant. But I didn't share that sensation at all. The only thing that defined the current frontline group was a successful spirit off of starting line, nothing else. None of the floor bosses had been easy. When they were in Madai, marveling at our victory over Ilfang, we were mourning the loss of Diavel, our raid party leader. So, why didn't you go back to the town after that? Asuna asked, wasting no breath. Temu blinked a few times at how direct her question was. Well, if I had to use a single word, then it was stubbornness? He looked at his shoulders, where Lazuli, Heiston, and Gendo all nodded. We knew that we weren't going to get into the frontier group, but when we were still stubborn in thinking that we knew more about the quest than anyone else, so we said to ourselves, before we give up and run back to the safe zone, let's test out how far we can get with quests alone. Quests alone? I asked, while next to me, Asuna gasped. Oh, does that mean the Q from Quasac is for... Yup, very astute, Asuna, Lazuli remarked, snapping her fingers. At this, thinking he was being called, the dark elf steward rushed over to the table, much to Lazuli's panic. But Asuna took the opportunity to order some honey ale. As the waiter left, Heiston took over the explanation. "You're correct. The Q is short for quest, and the sack came from our baseball-playing friend here. To refer to the sacks of gold would come away with." Asuna burst into cute laughter, and I added a stifled gurgle to my own that was much less cute, since the guilds we knew had cool, flashy names like Dragon Knights Brigade and Legend Braves. The sheer simple honesty of Quasac being short for questing for sacks had tickled our funny bones. The honey ale was conveniently brought out at that moment, and I took a swig of the sweet, refreshing liquid to quench my thirst. "I see. I'll be honest, I thought you folks were a little fishy at first, but the riddles are being answered for me. So the reason your gear's so good, despite you being broke, is because it's quest rewards? And the reason you looked so uncomfortable when we admitted we were in the front line group was because we felt guilty about dropping out," I mentally added. But something in the way Gindo tugged his short beard told me he understood my meaning. "Yes, that's right. You tend to get more experience than money for quests. And between all the rewards, with a selection of loot to take, you can assemble a pretty good set. Unfortunately, you'll need to go hunting to get those sacks of coins, though." "Now that you mention it, that's true," I admitted. But there was still one question on my mind. For being a quest-focused guild, how was it that they seemed so fresh and clean after reaching Castle Galley? The giant insects and arthropods in the barren canyons outside were about the toughest and the generic monsters you could find at this point. "So, you're telling me that you started the Dark Elf faction of the Elf War campaign quest on the 3rd floor, and you came here to Castle Galley to continue the Hidden Key quest?" I wondered. The 4 members of Quasac nodded. "That's right. Didn't you? Have you already recovered the key from this floor?" Heiston asked. I glanced at Asuna before replying. "Yeah, we just got back from finishing it. If you'd like, we can tell you the main points to watch out for." "That would be much appreciated," he smiled, inclining his head. Then he turned towards the water. "But I suppose the random mobs along the path were tougher than the actual riddle solving. Did you have any trouble with the giant bugs on the way to the castle?" I asked. A very smooth, leading question by my standards. My partner saw through this attempt, though, and cleared her throat uncomfortably. The 4 were as straightforward as their guild name suggested, though none appeared skeptical of my question. "Oh, we just left the attacking to our escort and focused on guarding the whole time," Gindo said, which didn't immediately make sense to me. Escort? You hired another player?" "Oh no, we don't have the money for that. I mean, the Dark Elf NPC. Don't you have one too?" he asked. I glanced at Asuna again. The first thought in my head at Dark Elf NPC was Kismel, but she wasn't our guard or escort. We didn't reunite her until we arrived at Castle Galley. Or did that mean they had their own Kismel, like us? Did they manage to beat the Forest Elven Hollowed Knight in the Forest of Wavering Mists, avoiding Kismel's death and giving them a companion? I glanced around the dining hall, but saw no one to fit the bill. Perhaps they had already broken up the party by the time they arrived. But that might mean our Kismel is in the treasure repository, might run across their Kismel somewhere in the castle. I couldn't imagine what would happen if that came to pass. Asuna filled the silence I was leaving. She asked hoarsely, "What is the name of your escort?" "Name?" repeated Gindo, taken aback. He looked at his companions. "You guys know the Blelf's name?" The other 3 shook their heads. Lazuli said, "The cursor just says Dark Elf Scout. Couldn't that be the name?" Now it was our turn to glance at one another. Kismel was a knight, not a scout. Her official title was Dark Elven Royal Guard. That made it much less likely that Quasac escorted was another Kismel, but I had to be sure. By the way, what is the gender of your escort? A man. He's a real dick, said Temu. Both Asa and I exhaled. Upon further inquiry, we learned that, initially designed their entry event for the quest featured the Dark Elf and Forest Elf both dying. The four managed to complete the camp commander's quest somehow, but at the final mission on the 3rd floor, retrieving the key, they were given a Dark Elven scout to serve as their escort and 5th party member. Apparently, he vanished at the entrance of the human towns, then reappeared when left them. If they undertook unrelated quests or hunted in any one spot, he would disappear again. He was exceedingly cold as befitted a dark elf, but did not argue in any kind of personal or small talk. When did the Elf War campaign quest in the beta as a solo? I didn't get an escort. What they were expecting was probably a support measure added to the official release. But if the elf was anywhere near as strong as Kismel, I could see how these 4 quest-centric players had gotten to Castle Galley without any damage. But at the same time, I sensed danger. This questline continued to the 9th floor. That scout escort would vanish there when the quest was over. Would they be able to keep up after that point without someone to do the heavy damage for them? I wondered these things and more as I sipped at my honey ale, but decided that it wasn't really my business. They'd done their other quests outside of the elf campaign without a bodyguard, and Asa and I certainly receive a great amount of tactical, emotional benefit from Kismel's presence. Given that the scout was just a simple bodyguard NPC to them, Quasac might find it easier to move on when the campaign was done without losing motivation. Gosh, look at the time, Gendo said, rousing me from my thoughts. The plates on the table had been cleaned off, and Temu and Lazuli looked sleepy. Gendo closed his window, got to his feet, and patted Temu on the head. Kirito, Asuna, it was a pleasure to chat with you. We're going to get our quests from the Lord of the Castle, so we'll take our leave for the day. No, thank you for letting us take up your time, said Asuna, getting up from her chair. I inclined my head, too. We agreed to meet up again in the morning and watch the 4 of them leave to the hall. When the doors closed and their cursors vanished from view, I gave my temporary partner member a look. After a long few seconds, Asuna muttered, I guess there are also people like them up near the front line too. I never considered the possibility of a quest-focused guild. Even without grinding for levels, you can get this far in quests loot alone, I guess. Not that we do that much grinding either, she pointed out. That's true. A lull followed, and eventually we exhaled simultaneously. It was a good thing that more players were becoming focused on leaving the towns and reaching the frontier, and being quest-centric opened up new possibilities for that. Our meeting with Gendo's group was a welcome development, but there was something in my chest that itched about it and refused to go away. Perhaps it was just some infantile irration that others had intruded on our supposed private relaxation time around the castle with Kismel. Castle Galley was a public location, so all players had the right to visit. In SAO, as in many MMORPGs, it was a classical violation of manners to claim a public space and refuse others the right to be there. As a fellow member of the Dark Elf faction of this questline, this was actually a place for us to trade useful information. I told myself to stop being childish and selfish, and to follow Asuna's example in the way she had cordially interacted with Quasac. And yet, earlier, I said that I wasn't a fan of instances. Now I take that back. My partner said out of the blue. I stared at her. Why? Because! Anyway, where was Kismel gone off to? She snapped, clearly trying to change the subject, and looking around the dining hall for no good reason. Virtually all the other Dark Elves had continued on their way, and of course Kismel wasn't here. Maybe she went back to her room? Oh, well, we should go back too, then. Yeah, good idea." The fencer promptly strode away. As I followed her, I wondered if I ever would fully understand the way her mind worked. No, I decided with a sigh, that day would probably never come.